All right, so the brain. So we'll get into the functions, the main functions of the areas of the brain later, maybe next week. But I do want to go over the anatomy of the brain because you all are going to have that test coming up here shortly. So structurally, first of all, you know where the brain is located, right? In relation to the spinal cord. It's the most superior portion of the central nervous system. And the brain equals about 97% of the body's neural tissue, nervous tissue in adults. The typical brain weighs about 3 pounds. The size varies slightly though among individuals. Males' brains are 10% larger than females' brains, and that's due to the difference in the overall body size in proportion. So there's no correlation, however, between brain size and intelligence. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and when you look at the surface of the brain, you'll see ridges of tissues or elevations, and then you'll see little creases or grooves within the brain. And we have some sheep brain here that I may have you all dissect next week, just to look at the surface of the brain. So the terminology is important here. So you'll see gyri and sulci and fissures. So you should have an idea of what that's referring to. So when you look at the brain, the outer part of the brain has the creases. Those creases are referred to as sulci. Sulci is plural though. So you'll usually see it as sulcus if you're just talking about one. Okay? So, and you'll need to know the names of some of them. So there's one called the central sulcus that we'll spend a lot of time talking about. So the sulci are the creases between the ridges or elevations of tissue. And the gyri would be the ridges or elevations of the cerebral tissue. Okay, and fissures are like sulci, except for they're a little bit deeper. So they're deeper grooves. Okay, again, gyri. Gyri is plural for what? Gyrus. Okay, and cerebral cortex. So the brain, the bulk of the brain, what we call the brain, is referred to as the cerebrum. Hold on a second. Which organ you all think is the most important? The brain, the heart. It's usually a competition between the brain and the heart. Cardiologists say the heart. Neurologists say the brain. But they're both important. The heart has to send nutrients to the brain, right? So they can't function without each other. The brain, though, is so important in everything related to who we are. So really, who you are, how you think, is really who you are, right? So if for example, a person had some type of traumatic brain injury, they could be somebody completely different. Even if they get on drugs really bad, they may be a completely different person. So next week I'll get a little bit more into the areas of the brain and those parts that control things like memory, vision, personality. But for now, just notice the structures and their relation to one another, where they're located. So when I say cerebrum, what I'm talking about, the brain has really 3 major parts to it. But the bulk of the brain, all of this here, is the cerebrum. But there's also this part which is called the cerebellum, which we'll get into. So the bulk of the brain, which we call the brain, is called the cerebrum. Okay? Whenever you see the word cerebral something, cerebral cortex, cerebral atrophy, cerebral edema, you know it's referring to what? The cerebrum. In fact, when you put AL on the end of a word, you all know what that is, the suffix AL, what that means? Any medical terminology students? It's common. Cerebral, AL means pertaining to. Okay, so the word cerebral means pertaining to the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, which we're talking about now, the cerebral cortex is the outermost surface of the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebral cortex is the outermost surface. So if you look at the whole cerebrum and you go in a few millimeters, it's very small, that's referred to as the cerebral cortex. And you'll hear a lot about the cerebral cortex because that's where a lot of the main functional areas of the brain are located, in that outer surface of the cerebrum, the gyri. Okay, so you can see here the cerebrum, the gyri and sulci again, and then the fissures. And the four main divisions of the brain: the cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. So those are the four main divisions of the brain. The cerebrum has two cerebral hemispheres. There's that word cerebral again. So what I'm showing you here on this model is the two separate hemispheres. Okay, so the hemispheres, that just means we have, our cerebrum has a left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The diencephalon includes the hypothalamus and the thalamus, as well as another part called the epithalamus. The brainstem we'll get into has the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then there is the cerebellum. So those are the four primary divisions of the brain. Okay, and on the test a week from today, the lab exam, you'll have to identify the parts, and this is one of the pictures I think you will see on that exam, but you'll have a lot more parts to it. If you have the study guide, you'll notice there are more parts labeled than I have on here. But this is just to show you those four divisions. The diencephalon includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The better you all are at breaking down words and knowing the word parts, the better it's going to make sense to you a lot quicker. So if you all have taken medical terminology, you may be ahead of everyone else and making sense of these new terms. So the word hypothalamus means what? Below the thalamus. Okay? So you should not, on the test, call this the hypothalamus and this the thalamus, because it doesn't make sense. The thalamus is above the hypothalamus because the word hypothalamus means below the thalamus. Okay? The brainstem has the three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. So those are the parts of the brainstem, and then you have the cerebellum. So you can see all those parts here. This is I guess a model that was used on the test last semester. So if you looked at your study guide, didn't it tell you to study the models as well? So you all may want to do that today as well. Well, probably not today. Wait till my advice would be to learn what's on the pictures first, and then once you know that, you'll have a general idea where things are in relation to each other. But you could take some pictures, I guess, with your phone, and then if you're studying for this over the weekend, you'll have pictures of it at least. So you can see the thalamus is here, the hypothalamus is here. Notice the orientation is different because you're looking at a different side of the hemisphere. That's on the screen. You have the left, but this is the right on the screen, and the one I'm holding here is left, cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so you have the thalamus and hypothalamus, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and of course the cerebrum and cerebellum. And I like to throw a picture like this up there so you can see. You can't really tell from looking at this picture, well, maybe slightly, that there's space up there in the area of the thalamus. So I wanted you all to see the picture here so you can see the thalamus is actually chunks of tissue, but above that is a space. You can almost stick your hand in that space. And the space is called ventricles. You all see that yet? That's on your study guide also. There are spaces within the brain that CSF flows through. What is CSF? Cerebrospinal fluid. So that CSF is going to fill up that space there, and that's the lateral ventricle. And then the fluid passes down into the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle. So you'll see that on all the models as well, the spaces that are there. Okay. All right, so with the cerebrum, let me put this back together. With the cerebrum, just like the skull, you had the four bones, right? The frontal bone, parietal, and occipital bones, and temporal bones. So you have the same lobes up on the brain. So the frontal lobe is the most anterior or rostral part of the brain. And then you have the parietal, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay? And again, they just correspond to the bone, the casing around them. There's also an insula, which is within the hemispheres, and you have to pull down the temporal lobe in order to see it. So the insula is shown there. It's deep within the lateral sulcus. Okay? All right. So this is one of those pictures you all are going to need to know for the test, be able to identify the structures. So for example, so you have the frontal lobe, and now you have the names of some gyri and sulci. So remember what gyri are? The ridges of tissue, right. So notice we have something up here called the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. And what's between those two? A sulcus, and that sulcus is called the central sulcus. So those, make sure you know those, because those are also important in some functions we're going to discuss next week. So the precentral, look at that word. What does the word even mean? Pre means before, so precentral means before the central sulcus. And postcentral means after the central sulcus. Okay, so don't mix those up. And so next week we'll talk about the functions of those. Actually, I'll go ahead and tell you now, but we'll mention it again. The precentral gyrus controls our voluntary movements. So remember we talked about when you want to write something, in order for you to make any voluntary movement, a signal has to make it from where to where? From the CNS to an effector, right? So any movement, the signal has to start in the CNS and end up at the effector that's going to allow the movement that we want to make. Well, the part of the CNS, now you know, is the precentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is the part of the brain that tells the muscles to contract when you want them to contract. Okay? So that's going to be called the primary motor cortex, or the primary motor area of the brain. So if there's a lesion or damage to that part of the brain, what would the effect be? So if I had a stroke, so this is where strokes happen. So if I had a stroke, and say this is the left hemisphere, so my left precentral gyrus is damaged because I've had a stroke. No blood is getting to that part of my brain. The precentral gyrus cells there are going to die in some part of it. Okay, so what would the effect be? Something on the right side of the body, what? Paralysis. Okay, so if there was damage to my left precentral gyrus, I would have paralysis on the right side of my body, on some part of it. It may just be my toe, it may be my whole leg, it may be my upper and lower limbs. It just depends on how much. There's a lot to the precentral gyrus. Okay, so if it's just this part, it may just be my face. So the precentral gyrus controls movements throughout the body. And there's actually a nice picture, I think, in your book of a homunculus. I guess later in the chapter, where you can see what particular part of the precentral gyrus controls the leg, the arm, the tongue, the face. Okay. The postcentral gyrus, on the other hand, is referred to as the primary somatic sensory cortex. The primary somatic sensory cortex. So this is the main sensory part of the brain. So if it's damaged, what do you think the result will be? So I have a stroke that damages part of my left postcentral gyrus. What do you think the effect is going to be? Since I said this is the part that controls sensation, primary sensory. I'd lose some sensation somewhere. Where? On the right side of my body. So I may be completely numb on my arm or my foot. Again, depending on how much of the postcentral gyrus is affected. But notice when people have a stroke, a lot of times they may lose both sensory and motor function. And that's because of where they are in relation to each other. So if there's a loss of blood flow to this part of my brain, it's probably going to be a loss of blood flow to some part of the postcentral gyrus as well. So if you lose blood flow to the precentral gyrus, it's likely that there may be part of the postcentral gyrus affected as well. Okay? The postcentral gyrus is primary somatic sensory cortex. So keyword there, sensory. All right. So see if that makes sense to you. So if my finger is pricked, that activates receptors on my finger, right? So the signal travels where? Into my spinal cord, and then to which gyrus? The postcentral gyrus. Okay? So keep that in mind. Sensation, activation of a receptor. I don't feel anything until the receptors ensure that the signal makes it all the way to my postcentral gyrus. And again, if those cells are not alive anymore, then I'm not able to recognize the sensation. Any part of that path can be damaged, and I would not experience this sensation. Okay? And the occipital lobe. So notice the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. What's the dividing point? The frontal lobe ends at the what? At the central sulcus. Okay? So the precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. Okay? And then you have the occipital lobe, which functions in vision. Okay? So if there is a lesion, damage to the occipital lobe, you would lose some aspect of vision. Then you have the temporal lobe, and it is separated from the frontal and parietal lobe by the lateral sulcus. Why do you think it's called lateral sulcus? This is on the side. Good. Good. Okay. And then you have the cerebellum there. So a lot of new terms. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a minute for you all to get those down. So the central sulcus, we saw that, separates the what? Frontal and parietal lobe. It also separates precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Good. Longitudinal fissure, we didn't see that. But the longitudinal fissure separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Good. The lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. Good. The transverse cerebral, transverse means across, cerebral fissure. So that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So there. So that would be here, between the cerebellum and cerebrum. Transverse cerebral fissure. And the pre and post central gyrus. So you all know those in relation to one another anatomically. All right, and this the picture here at the bottom just shows you the cortex. Remember what I said about the cortex, the cerebral cortex? It's the outermost layer of the cerebrum, and what you have in that area are cell bodies of neurons. Notice the gray matter. Notice the color difference. So the cortex is gray matter. The cerebral cortex is gray matter. Remember in the spinal cord, the gray matter was inside and the white matter surrounded the gray matter. Well, on the cerebrum, it's just the opposite. The gray matter is outside, it makes up the cortex. And what is it that makes gray matter gray, primarily? Cell bodies. Good, the cell bodies. And the white matter is primarily white tracks because it is made up of myelin. Good. And also showing you the difference between a fissure and a sulcus. Yes. Yep. So you can see a chunk of the cerebrum was taken out, just to show you up close what it would look like. So the gray matter is on the outside, made up of cell bodies. So you can imagine the cell bodies. So what do we find in the cell body? The nucleus. So if you had a thinking part of a cell, it would probably be in the nuclear area. So the cell body is kind of the brain of a neuron, if you could use it that way. So the cell bodies are going to be located in the gray matter, in the cortex. And also, so keep in mind that this is an important part, so if it's damaged, then some function of the body is going to be lost, something important. All right. And then you have the longitudinal fissure is here. All right. And I'm going to stop there, because this is going into the functions, and I wanted to go over the functions next week.